In December 1941, Japan's most senior naval officers gathered in a room and agreed on something they did not write down. They had 18 months. 18 months before American industrial production would make the outcome of the war inevitable. Every decision Japan made for the next 3.5 years was made against that clock. They knew the clock was running. They knew they could not stop it. They attacked anyway. What followed was not a story of fanaticism. It was not a story of mindless aggression. It was a story of a nation that understood, with precise clarity, that it had no good options, and chose the least bad one. The war that followed killed between 2 and 3 million Japanese soldiers and sailors. It killed between 500,000 and 1 million Japanese civilians. It burned 87 Japanese cities to the ground. It ended with 2 cities erased in single moments. Most of the world knows how it ended. Very few people know what the Japanese people believed they were fighting for. This is that story. Understand Japan in 1941, you have to understand the 50 years that preceded it. Japan had watched what happened to China. It had watched what happened to India. It had watched the European powers carve the Asian continent into spheres of influence, extracting resources and installing compliant governments. It had drawn a conclusion. The conclusion was simple, and in its own terms, not unreasonable. In the world as it existed, there were 2 kinds of nations. Nations that extracted, nations that were extracted from. Japan had spent the Meiji era of the 1880s and 1890s in a ferocious sprint to join the first category before it was forced into the second. It had modernized its military, its industry, its legal code, and its educational system in a single generation. It had defeated China in 1895. It had defeated Russia in 1905. That victory over Russia was the first time in the modern era that an Asian nation had defeated a European power in open warfare. The news traveled across Asia in ways that the European colonial powers found deeply uncomfortable. Japan entered the First World War on the Allied side. It sat at the peace table in Versailles in 1919, expecting to be treated as a major power. It was not. The racial equality clause it proposed for the League of Nations was rejected. The message was received. Japan was allowed to win. It was not allowed to belong. In the 1930s, the pressure intensified. The United States placed escalating economic restrictions on Japan in response to its expansion into China. In the summer of 1941, America froze Japanese assets and imposed an oil embargo. Japan imported 80% of its oil from the United States. The embargo was a slow sentence. Japan had oil reserves for approximately 18 months of full military operations. After that, the fleet would stop. The army would stop. Everything would stop. The men who ran Japan's military in 1941 did not see themselves as aggressors. They saw themselves as a nation cornered. That self-image would drive every decision that followed. The decision to go to war. The decision to keep fighting when losing became certain. The decision, at the very end, to die rather than surrender. Whether that self-image was accurate is a different question entirely. What matters for this story is that it was real, and it shaped everything. The attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, was not a desperate gamble by a nation acting without thought. It was the product of months of calculation. Admiral Yamamoto had opposed going to war with the United States. He had lived in America. He had studied at Harvard. He knew what American industrial capacity looked like from the inside. He had said, in a private letter written years before the attack, that if war came, he could run wild for 6 to 12 months. After that, he had no confidence whatsoever. He was right about the first part. He was right about the second part too. The plan he designed for Pearl Harbor was brilliant. It was also, from the beginning, built on an assumption that failed. The assumption was that a devastating opening blow would force the United States to negotiate. That assumption required the United States to behave rationally. It required America to weigh the cost of reclaiming the Pacific against the cost of accepting a negotiated settlement. Yamamoto understood the industrial math. He did not understand what the images from Pearl Harbor would do to American public opinion. The attack sank or damaged 18 ships. It killed 2,403 Americans. It failed to destroy the aircraft carriers, which were at sea. It failed to destroy the oil storage facilities at Pearl Harbor. It failed to destroy the repair infrastructure. It produced exactly one certain outcome. It made negotiation impossible. The Japanese soldiers and sailors who flew that mission did not know that. They came home to celebrations. The newspapers carried the news with pride. What the newspapers did not carry was Yamamoto's private assessment. He stood on the deck of his flagship after receiving the battle reports. He did not celebrate. He did not speak for a long time. The officers around him waited. He finally said something that none of them forgot. He said he feared they had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. That line would define the next 4 years. The Japanese public did not hear it. They were not meant to. The management of public information in wartime Japan was not incidental to the war effort. It was central to it. Victories were announced with ceremony and detail. Defeats were managed with silence and euphemism. When the carrier Shoho was sunk in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the announcement described the ship as having suffered damage. When the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Tsuryu, and Hiryu were destroyed at Midway in June 1942, the 4 carriers that had led the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese public was told of a great strategic victory. The men who died in those ships are still at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. For years, their families did not know where they were. 6 months after Pearl Harbor were exactly what Yamamoto had predicted. Japan moved with a speed and coordination that no Western power had anticipated. Malaya fell in 70 days. The British fortress of Singapore, described by Churchill as the Gibraltar of the East, fell in a week. The Philippines fell. Burma fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. By the spring of 1942, Japan controlled a territory stretching from the borders of India to the edge of the Central Pacific. It was the largest empire in Asian history. It would also prove to be the most difficult empire in history to defend. The Japanese military had a problem that its victories had temporarily obscured. It had planned brilliantly for conquest. It had not planned seriously for occupation. The territories Japan now controlled were vast, ethnically diverse, economically complex, and separated from the Japanese home islands by thousands of kilometers of ocean. Holding them required a navy that could keep the supply lines open. Holding them required an army spread thin across an enormous theater. And holding them required that the United States not find a way to begin cutting those supply lines before Japan could consolidate. The United States found that way at Midway. The Battle of Midway on the 4th of June, 1942, lasted 4 minutes in its most critical phase. 4 Japanese fleet carriers were destroyed. 322 Japanese aircraft were lost. 747 Japanese naval aviators were killed. Many of them were the most experienced carrier pilots in the world. They could not be quickly replaced. America could replace its losses. Japan could not. The clock that Japan's senior commanders had been watching since 1941 had not stopped running. It had accelerated. The Japanese public did not know about Midway, not the real Midway. They were told of a battle in the Pacific in which Japan had suffered some losses while inflicting greater damage on the enemy. The emperor's portrait was carried through the streets. Prayers were offered at shrines. The war continued. Somewhere in the Pacific, the families of 747 men were waiting for letters that would never come. They would wait for a long time before they understood why. The Japanese home front in the first years of the war was not a monolith. It is one of the most persistent misconceptions about the Pacific War. The image of a unified, fanatical Japanese nation embracing death before dishonor is a caricature. It is a caricature that served purposes on both sides of the war. The reality was considerably more complicated. There were true believers, officers and soldiers who had absorbed the ideology of Bushido and the cult of the emperor completely. Men who genuinely believed that dying in service to the emperor was the highest possible act. Men who saw surrender not as a military option, but as a spiritual impossibility. These men were real. They were not the majority. There were also ordinary people trying to survive. Factory workers in Osaka, putting in 12-hour shifts because they had been told their labor was essential. Mothers in Tokyo watching their rice ration shrink month by month. Farmers in Hokkaido harvesting crops they were not allowed to keep. There were dissidents. Academics who had been silenced in the 1930s when the military government moved to consolidate control of public discourse. Politicians who had opposed the war found themselves removed from influence. Soldiers who fought with valor and privately doubted. None of this dissent was organized enough to matter. The military government had spent the decade before the war systematically removing the institutional structures through which dissent could be expressed. The press was controlled. The political parties had been dissolved and replaced with a single organization loyal to the government. The educational system taught loyalty to the emperor as the foundation of all other knowledge. Doubt was not illegal. It was simply made invisible. There was one place where reality eventually became impossible to conceal. The front lines. Soldiers in China, in the Pacific Islands, in the jungles of Burma and New Guinea, wrote letters home that told the truth. Some of those letters arrived. Many were intercepted by military censors. The ones that arrived painted a picture that did not match the newspapers. Hunger, disease, the sense that something was going wrong in ways that could not be named. A soldier named Ogawa Tamatsu, writing to his family from Guadalcanal in the winter of 1942, described a meal of dried grass. He said he had not seen rice in 3 weeks. He did not mention the Americans, he mentioned the rain. It had not stopped raining for 40 days. Island hopping campaign that the United States launched in the second half of 1942 was a different kind of war from anything Japan had planned for. American planners made a decision that Japanese strategists had not fully anticipated. They would not try to retake every island Japan held. They would select the strategically critical ones and bypass the rest. Japanese garrisons on bypassed islands would be left to starve. Many of them did. The Japanese military response to this strategy had a name, Gyokusai. It translated roughly as shattering like a jewel. It meant fighting to the last man rather than surrendering. The first major Gyokusai happened on the island of Attu in the Aleutian Islands in May 1943. 2,600 Japanese soldiers were trapped on the island with no possibility of evacuation. They launched a final charge into the American lines. By the time it was over, only 28 Japanese soldiers remained alive to be taken prisoner. The rest were dead. The Japanese press described the battle as a glorious death. It described the men who died as having fulfilled their duty to the emperor. It did not describe what the battle actually looked like. It did not describe what Gyokusai meant for the families of 2,600 men. The pattern repeated itself across the Pacific: Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. At Saipan in the summer of 1944, the Japanese garrison and a significant portion of the civilian population chose death over capture. Thousands of Japanese civilians jumped from the cliffs on the northern coast of the island. They had been told that American soldiers would torture and kill them. Some had been told this by Japanese military officers who preferred that outcome to the alternative. That alternative was surrender. Surrender meant that Japanese civilians would see, with their own eyes, that the stories they had been told about the enemy were not true. That knowledge, in the minds of Japan's military leadership, was more dangerous than the American guns. The cliffs at Saipan are called Banzai Cliff and Suicide Cliff today. The names record the event without explaining it. What they do not record is what the people who went over them were thinking in the final moments. We do not know their names. We know what they were told. We know what they chose. By the winter of 1944, Japan was losing the war in ways that could no longer be disguised. The merchant fleet had been devastated by American submarines. American submarines sank over 1,400 Japanese merchant ships during the war. The raw materials Japan needed to keep its factories running could no longer reliably reach the home islands. Steel production fell. Aircraft production fell. The quality of the pilots who flew those aircraft had already fallen. The experienced aviators of Pearl Harbor and Midway were gone. Their replacements were trained faster, with less fuel, on shorter curricula. A Japanese naval aviator in 1941 received between 300 and 500 hours of flight training before entering combat. A Japanese naval aviator in 1944 received approximately 100 hours. The aircraft they flew were often better on paper than the planes they faced. The pilots who flew them were not. Into this deteriorating situation, the Japanese Navy introduced a new category of weapon, the Takotai, the special attack units. The Western world called them kamikaze. The word means divine wind. It referred to the typhoons that had destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century. The name was chosen with deliberate symbolism. The tactic was simple. Pilots would fly their aircraft directly into American ships. The aircraft was the weapon. The pilot's survival was not part of the plan. The pilots who volunteered for these missions, and many of them did volunteer, were not suicidal maniacs. They were young men who had been taught that the highest possible act was to die in service to the emperor. They were young men who could see clearly that Japan was losing. They were young men who believed that their death might be the thing that changed the calculation. One of them, a pilot named Hayashi Ichizo, wrote a letter to his mother the night before his mission. He told her not to be sad. He told her that he was grateful for the life she had given him. He told her he was not afraid. He was 23 years old. His letter was not discovered until decades after the war. It is now held in a museum. The kamikaze attack sank 34 American ships. They damaged nearly 400 more. They did not change the outcome of the war. They could not have changed the outcome of the war. The men who ordered the program knew this. They ordered it anyway. A program designed to produce death as its primary purpose. Not victory, death. The distinction matters. The firebombing of Tokyo on the 9th and 10th of March 1945 is not well known in the West. It should be. 334 American B-29 bombers flew over Tokyo that night. They dropped incendiary bombs, not explosive bombs, fire. Tokyo in 1945 was a city of wood. 15.8 square miles burned in one night. Between 80,000 and 100,000 people died. More died that night in Tokyo than in either of the atomic bombings that followed. The raid was followed by similar attacks on Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and 64 other Japanese cities. By the summer of 1945, the air raids had killed between 300,000 and 500,000 Japanese civilians. Many of the cities targeted had almost no military value. The strategy was not targeted destruction of military assets. It was the destruction of civilian morale and the civilian infrastructure required to support the war economy. It worked in that it destroyed the infrastructure. It did not produce a Japanese surrender. Nothing did. Not the loss of the Pacific Islands, not the destruction of the merchant fleet, not the fire raids, not the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima on the 6th of August, 1945, not the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki on the 9th of August. What produced the surrender was the emperor. On the 15th of August, 1945, Hirohito spoke on the radio. It was the first time most Japanese people had ever heard his voice. His statement did not use the word surrender. It said Japan would endure the unendurable. It said Japan would bear the unbearable. The meaning was clear. In military units across Japan and across Asia, soldiers heard the broadcast and wept. Some of them could not accept it. A group of junior officers attempted a coup the night before the broadcast to prevent it from being made. They failed. Some officers did not accept the surrender at all. They continued fighting. A Japanese soldier named Onoda Hiro continued fighting in the jungles of the Philippines until 1974. He was 29 years old when the war ended. He was 61 when someone finally convinced him it was over. He had spent 30 years refusing to believe. Not because he was unaware, because he had been taught that certain things were impossible. Surrender was one of them. The occupation of Japan began in September 1945. American troops arrived in a country they expected to resist them. Japan did not resist them. What the Americans found was not fanaticism, it was exhaustion. A people who had been told for 15 years that sacrifice and endurance would produce victory. A people who had sacrificed everything, who had endured everything, and who had not received the victory they had been promised. The cities were ruins. The economy had collapsed. The emperor, whose divine status had been used to justify everything, would sign a document the following year declaring himself not divine. The document was written in English. A Japanese translator worked through the night to render it into language his country could absorb. He did the best he could. Some things do not translate. The soldiers who came home, those who survived, returned to a country that did not know how to receive them. The war had been fought in the emperor's name. The emperor had surrendered. Talking about what the soldiers had done and what had been done to them was complicated. Many of them did not talk about it at all. Their children grew up knowing almost nothing. Their grandchildren grew up knowing even less. The memory did not go away. It went underground. Ogawa Tamatsu, the soldier who had written home from Guadalcanal about the rain and the dried grass, survived the war. He was taken prisoner in 1943. He returned to Japan in 1946. He lived until 1989. He never spoke about Guadalcanal. He did not speak about the dried grass. He did not speak about the rain. No one asked him. He carried it alone. The formal surrender of Japan on the 2nd of September 1945 aboard the American battleship Missouri ended the war in the Pacific. The occupation that followed lasted until 1952. American forces oversaw the dismantling of the military, the restructuring of the government, and the drafting of a new constitution. The Constitution prohibited Japan from maintaining offensive military forces. It was written in 9 days. It is still in effect today. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima left one building standing near its hypocenter. The Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall. Its dome had partially collapsed, but its structure remained. It is now called the Atomic Bomb Dome. It has been preserved exactly as it was found in August 1945. It is a United Nations heritage site. No one enters it. The preservation is of the ruin, not of what the building once was. Japan rebuilt. The speed and completeness of the reconstruction became one of the defining economic stories of the second half of the 20th century. By 1968, Japan was the world's second largest economy. A country that had been deliberately bombed into rubble had become, within a generation, one of the most productive industrial nations on Earth. The question of how this happened is still being studied. The more difficult question is what it cost to achieve it. Japan's experience in the Pacific War shaped the country's relationship with military force for 80 years. The Constitution's prohibition on offensive military capability was not merely a legal constraint imposed by the Americans. It reflected something that large parts of the Japanese population genuinely wanted. They had seen where military leadership had taken them. They did not want to go there again. Yet the war itself, who was responsible for it, what Japan did during it, what was done to Japan remains contested in ways that have not resolved. The history textbook debates that recur in Japan every decade are not academic disputes. They are arguments about national identity, about what Japan was and what it wants to be. Yamamoto Isoroku knew from the beginning that the war could not be won. He designed the attack on Pearl Harbor anyway. He was killed in 1943 when American fighters ambushed his transport aircraft after intercepting a decoded message describing his flight plan. The code Japan used was the same code they had used at Pearl Harbor. The Americans had broken it. They had broken it before the attack. They had been reading Japanese military communications for months before a single bomb fell. History is full of plans built on assumptions that had already been disproved. The men who made those plans were not stupid. They simply could not afford to believe what they knew. If this story changed how you see the Pacific War, subscribe. Every week, we find the version of events that most people never heard.